another highly politicized case, which we'll see where it goes as well, is the Giuliani. Well, it is the Eric Coomer, Dr. Eric Coomer, when he shows up on CNN. He is a doctor. I'm not trying to be demeaning. It's just framing is everything. Dr. Eric Coomer has sued Sidney Powell, Lynn Wood, Giuliani, Trump campaign, yada, 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 for defamation, for statements they made suggesting that Coomer had prearranged certain results, had certain connections, certain ties, had made certain statements on certain conference calls that some people got, tapped into with him and Antifa members. Yeah, we've talked about the lawsuits. We've talked about the substance. He sat down for deposition. And, it's not I read through the deposition very quickly because it's a very long deposition. Even when it's 4x4, it's still 200 pages. And you go through the back and forth between the lawyers, the stenographer, the witnesses. Bottom line, Giuliani, he confirmed what we all knew, basically, is that they didn't really have the evidence to substantiate the statements, the public statements they were making. He heard stories. He heard this from that person. He heard this from this person, saw some reports. By and large, the same vortex that occurs with CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, sometimes occurs with the Daily Wire and other right-leaning sites. They cite a story, repeats, and so on. He goes out publicly, makes very big, bold statements, which ultimately he doesn't seem to be able to substantiate, and it doesn't look good. Also in his deposition, he confirmed why or that, without really going into the why, they had to distance themselves from Sidney Powell after certain public statements she made. So it doesn't look very good. The only thing that really pisses me off in this entire story is Rachel Maddow's smug face as she's reporting on this. She could be reporting on herself, but right now she's reporting on Giuliani, saying, he checked social media, he checked Facebook posts, and they ran with it. Robert, what do you make of the situation? If you went through the deposition, what do you make of that? And what do you make of the longer term outcome in this case, given what is being, publicized now as the very big admissions Giuliani made during his deposition?
Well, I found Rudy's source for some of the more interesting allegations, and they look a lot like this. That was Rudy's source. Rudy spent a lot of time, imbibing that source of information during that time period. So, Rudy was able to get the case in part because of his longer legacy and reputation. It's now relatively public knowledge, but it was either me and a group of lawyers were going to handle all the election cases, or Rudy was going to. And the way Rudy got him is, first he claimed credit for work that I and other people had done. And that's how Trump gained confidence in him, because he was right about those things, but he just took them from us. This led Rudy down a bad path, though, because what Rudy's, I can pick up information from whoever's around me. Turns out it's accurate. I can get control of the case and win. That's not a good, effective mechanism, because our source was actual legal research and factual research and long legal history and a long political knowledge. And Sidney Powell got involved because she claimed to have because neither Rudy nor Sidney Powell have ever done, until this time period, ever in their lives, any election litigation of any kind. The lawyers that are on our side of the aisle had been doing it for more than 20 years and had over 100 cases of experience. You couldn't have a more massive gap of information, more massive gap of understanding. So how do they get it? They get it by saying they have special secret information. And one, they steal information that comes from other people. Credit to them. It's what it is. But the other thing they did is claim, Sidney in particular, claimed its super secret sources of intel and information. And I kept telling everybody, I know it's crap, because Richard Barris and I have already looked at the data, and this is crap. This Dominion stuff is nonsense. And then they started being very specific. And I was saying, you're making specific statements that are easily provable false with 5 seconds of search. You're saying Smartmatic and Dominion are the same. They were not. You're saying Dominion was involved in Venezuela and China. No, wrong. I have always been a critic of machines. The people on the left were my usual allies at being critics of machines. People like Bobby Kennedy Jr. going back to 2004, very critical of machines. So it's not like I'm a fan of machines. It was just that had nothing to do with what happened in this election that was legally questionable and to be contested. But they didn't want to hear that, and they told Trump they had separate, super secret intel sources. And because they had stolen some information and got credit for that, Trump thought, and Trump knew Rudy Giuliani, the mob buster. But what we saw in that deposition is what we talked about all the way back to November of last year, almost a year ago. Said, here's where this path goes down. This path is a disaster. Here's why it's a disaster. Here's because they don't know. They don't have independent sources. They don't. I remember we were discussing early on, would Dominion sue? And I said, absolutely, they're going to sue. And the people connected to them are going to sue. Now, look at where they sued. They don't sue in Texas. They don't sue in Florida. Even though Sidney Powell's in Texas and Trump's in Florida, they sue in Colorado. They sue in New York. They sue in the District of Columbia. That's where they sue, liberal jurisdictions that they know the jury pool's already in their pocket before the case even starts. And so I think it is unfortunate because I like Rudy. I have mixed views of his legacy. I think there was a lot of corruption in the cases that he did, a lot of prosecutorial abuse in the cases he did. He's apologized for a lot of that, but so I'm not as fan that other people are fans of. But Rudy, the political personality, Rudy, the mayor, Rudy, the person, often a fun guy to be around. But he's now paying the price for wanting one last grab at power and money when he was not equipped, and he knew he was not equipped to handle these cases. And I'll never pardon either him or Sidney Powell on this, because they did severe damage to what could have been a very robust legal challenge. And the media will be able to run with their version of events to recharacterize everything that took place in the election. So like when the Pennsylvania Attorney General is trying to stop the election audit, what is he citing? He's citing all of those examples, even though that's not what the Pennsylvania officials are auditing at all. They're not focused on the machines. They're focused on, did only constitutionally qualified people vote? And so it's unfortunate, but yes, it was embarrassing, and it will continue to be embarrassing.
Yeah, but bottom line, people don't like some of what they're hearing right now, but we said it. First of all, I can't take credit for your knowledge, and I'm not trying to pass the buck or pass the blame. It's like you pointed out certain things at the time, certain broader things we both agreed on. You're like, if you're making exquisitely extravagant claims, you better have extremely compelling evidence. And you listen to the deposition, and bottom line, it's just like, it's willy-nilly nonsense. Like, okay, we had a big team. Everyone was sort of dealing with certain things. I was hearing this from this person who was on charge of that team, but I was paying attention and focusing on Pennsylvania and Michigan election lawsuits. So I wasn't personally vetting any of these statements that I was making. And it doesn't look good. It didn't look good coming out of it. And by and large, no one has found any evidence, despite everyone on the internet looking for it, of the statements they made about Eric Coomer in particular. And you're dealing with a guy. This is one interesting question as to whether or not he's a public figure just because he's an executive or a higher up at a public company. I'm not convinced that that's a decent threshold, because it's not because you work at a company that you become a public figure for the purposes of defamation. But there's no question in the context of that election, saying the things that were said about Eric Coomer can lead to very serious problems for Eric Coomer. And if you didn't have the evidence and you didn't have the personal knowledge of what you were saying, it was a very dangerous line to be walking. But like you saying, where I think a lot of your personal resentment comes, is that it undermined the other legitimate aspects, and now it allows it just lump it in a bag of crap. And it's what were the legitimate grievances are now lumped with this crap in a bag, and everyone else suffers.
It put everything in there's such a shadow that nobody ever will look at it in detail in the way they could and should have. I mean, there's some people that still have, to the credit of a lot of activists, to the credit of a lot of state legislative officials, they have marched forward with the issues. And that's probably a good bridge into Pennsylvania. The state Senate in Pennsylvania looked at the audit taking place in Arizona and said, we should do the same thing. We should make sure that only constitutionally qualified people voted. We should look at the entire process that went into this, what training was given to people, what guidelines were given to people, what advice was given to people, and their focus is on the information contained by the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania. Well, the Attorney General, the same Attorney General who was predicting things about election outcomes before they happened, that Attorney General in Pennsylvania, who, critically, Democrats put a heavy focus in 2018 of winning these key offices in these key swing states, and it was ultimately consequential. And then sometimes in Republican states, they made sure they were on board too, like Ratburger in Georgia. And so with the state Senate saying, we want to take a look at this. We want to get all the relevant records and information so we can meaningfully forensically audit the election. The Attorney General comes in and goes nuts And he claims to be defending the privacy of the voters of Pennsylvania. Now, he makes some interesting claims in his petition to quash this. So the subpoena is issued for all this information to be able to get the information necessary to audit it forensically, to produce a report about whether are the protocols good, are the procedures good, is the training good, are there signs of anomalies, how can those anomalies be fixed and remedied, how substantial were those anomalies, etc. And but what's interesting is in filing the petition to quash the subpoena issued by the Pennsylvania State Senate, the Attorney General makes some interesting claims. He says things like, this data can't be turned over to any third party, because if it is, you can change registration records and you can even send ballots out to people where they don't live. And it's like, where did that information come from? I thought nothing like that could happen.
That might be
general.
That might be an indication of the very problem and not a reason not to look into it. One might say.
No doubt. And so they can redact some of the information, but the information they're requesting, like addresses, date of birth, that information's already widely available out there about people in commercial databases. People's partial social security numbers, also widely available. Not the full social security number, but partial ones, widely available. Driver's license numbers, easily available. So the idea that this is super private information that you can't let the Pennsylvania State Senate look into isn't that persuasive to me. And in particular, when you contrast it with what they're looking for, because what the Attorney General doesn't talk about, he goes on for hundreds and hundreds of paragraphs talking about how terrible Trump is and how awful it is that anybody challenged it's just a purely polemical piece. You have to get to the very end. It's like, well, what's your legal objection? Oh, that's a privacy objection. Okay, right. Why did you go into hundreds of paragraphs of this gibberish? Really, what he doesn't want to talk about is they need that information to double check, making sure there weren't double votes, or making sure people didn't vote who weren't supposed to. And you need certain information about that person, partial social securities, driver license numbers, date of birth, to match with addresses, because otherwise what happens is you get caught in the situation Matt Braynard does, where Matt Braynard says, I think here's some questionable ballots, but we can't prove that unless we have this additional information to make sure there's not some weird anomaly, like somebody has the same name and the voting registrar just listed the wrong person as voting, that kind of thing. And that's the information he doesn't want them to have. And it's interesting that he's so obsessed with that. I get it's in the name of privacy, but it's almost as if there's something in there that he doesn't want the state Senate to get. Last but not least, he claims there are multiple audits in Pennsylvania. What he's talking about are risk-limiting audits. And the risk-limiting audits they did in Pennsylvania did not use what the standards of the United States Election Assistance Commission and others say you're supposed to do in a risk-limiting audit, and that is signature matches. No signature match check has yet happened in Pennsylvania. Hopefully this audit will do that, because signature matches are the best way to highlight potential problems with what happened in the election and areas needed for reform for future elections.
All right, now Mike Bruno says, wrong, Barnes. Pennsylvania had assigned voting. I don't know that I know what that means.
Yeah, I don't know what he means by that either, by assigned voting.
Now, actually, one question that I forgot to ask you, Robert, before I forget, going back to deposition of Giuliani and Coomer. I read a couple of reports because people sent me an article. I didn't know the source. Coomer's deposition was kept private. It was sealed, allegedly because he was unhinged in his deposition. I'd love to hear what he was screaming about. This comes from Eugene Hong. I've read that, but it only seems to be the same article being cited and recited by other sites. They are right-leaning, and I say that without judgment. So I didn't hear about Coomer's deposition even being conducted.
Yeah, I saw that too, and I saw no confirmation of that.
Okay, so
the only thing I would say is this process of having unsealed depositions for one side and sealed depositions for the other side, I'm not a fan of. It creates a perception of imbalance.
Well, forget that. The depositions should never be sealed regardless. If there's information in there that needs to be redacted, you can have certain sections blacked out, but an entire deposition, if the guy's unhinged, I want to see it. But if he's revealing code for whatever that trade secrets, right, I don't necessarily need to see that. Okay, very, very interesting. There was a good segue, but I lost my train of thought into the next subject, which is